Oi, oi, it's your boy, the Elvis Brenner of Lend Us a Tenner, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're coming at you following UFC Abu Dhabi. Back on Fight Island, but not Fight Island, the Etihad Arena. Interesting event, some good fights, some awful fights shoved on there because they had good fights on there. We've very mercifully escaped washed Nick Diaz versus post-brain bleed Vicente Luque, which is always good. But I think I said this on the Boycast, when the UFC booked Conor McGregor, sold a higher gate than ever before, and then Conor McGregor's fight fell through, there was an air of, oh, what if we could do this deliberately? And I feel like they might have done that with Nick Diaz. Because when were you ever going to get Nick Diaz, avid weed smoker, to compete in the Middle East? But anyway, the card was better for his absence. Loads to talk about. Let's start at the main event, because I'm always asking for bantamweight matchups at the top of cards, because that division is stacked. Every matchup in that division is banging. And somehow every fight night is still headlined by either women's bantamweights or heavyweights. Give me men's bantamweights all the time, always. There's enough that they could headline every card of the year. This one's been in the works for a year. If you haven't read my article, Umar Nurmagomedov, the Dark Horse, go read it. But in that, I mentioned this fight was due to take place almost a year ago. So they've been preparing for each other for more than a year. And I went in expecting a good technical fight, and I came out getting a completely different technical fight to the one that I expected, but really impressed. Really impressed. Umar Nurmagomedov, I watched all his fights. I said, oh, there's some stuff here on the feet that needs some work. He's getting better, but it really needs some work. And then loads of that was improved in this fight. And then Corey Sandhagen, obviously, he looked great wrestling against Song Yadong. He looked great wrestling against Rob Font and everyone he's fought recently. But there was still this looming spectre of the fact that Aljamain Sterling hopped on his back in like a minute and choked him out along the fence. And then early in this fight, he gives up his back and Umar Nurmagomedov jumps on it. And you went, oh dear, is it happening again? And no, Corey was actually phenomenal in his defensive grappling in this fight. So what I'm saying is, great fight, lads. I could watch these two fight a dozen more times, but that ain't the way fighting works. Umar Nurmagomedov finally gets to be considered a real contender because he fought a decent fighter. Corey Sandhagen, lots of questions over him. People saying like, oh, did Trevor Whitman ruin him? This, that, and the other. We'll get into like the details now. So, okay, things that I like from this fight. Corey Sandhagen, we talked about Umar's back control in my article, how he is the rear naked choke guy. People are saying like, oh, he's going to knock out Merab. It's like, he's got 2 knockouts in his 20-something fight career, 18 fight career. But he has a whole heap of submissions, and almost all of them are rear naked chokes. He gets on backs and he chokes people. But the rear naked choke is a deceptive thing to look at on records, because a rear naked choke, I mean, it's the reason it's the most popular submission in MMA. You could get on someone's back and work for a rear naked choke against a completely responsive, competent opponent, or you could punch someone in the head, they could fall on the floor, and then you could jump on their back and rear naked choke them while Tweety Bird is circling around their head. So when you look at Umar versus like Islam and Khabib, there's a big difference there, because Khabib gets a lot of rear naked chokes, gets on people's backs, but he rides the back of the turtle for long periods, and Islam does the same. And the reason that they do that is that's partly an AKA thing too. They don't like to put the hooks in until they've worn their guy down a bit. Because if you put the hooks in and the guy rolls over, you're on the bottom looking up at the ceiling, even if you're on his back. And that happened like a half a dozen times in this fight. Corey Sandhagen did a roll while Umar Nurmagomedov was trying to get on his back, and then Corey Sandhagen ended up sat on top of Umar Nurmagomedov, going backwards and having to fight hands and stuff, but still much better than being underneath him getting punched. And Umar's had a couple of fights in the UFC. Sergey Morozov is a really good example, where he got behind Sergey Morozov early with the back body lock, and then he jumped to get on Sergey Morozov's back, and Sergey Morozov went into a tripod, or a quad pod more accurately, because he's got 2 hands down. But when you got your hands down, you're in not a turtle, you got hands and feet on the floor with your butt in the air, like you're bear crawling. And when guys do that and you don't have hooks in, you fall straight over the top. Almost happened to Guram on this card, and he did a really cool thing to get out of that, which we'll talk about later. But Umar's desire to get on Corey Sandhagen's back and start choking him was really apparent in this fight. And Sandhagen kept giving up his back and then working out from there. One thing I was really impressed by, the peeling of the hands by Sandhagen. When a guy gets behind you and he locks his hands around your body, not jumped on your back yet, he's just behind you and he's threatening to pick you up or trip you down sideways or just mat return you generally, you have to try and separate their hands and turn back into them. But separating the hands is a struggle in itself. And it's kind of like separating hands on an armbar. If you can spot how their hands are locked, you can address it with the right thing. But being able to do the right thing instead of just trying to spaz out and do a strong thing in the middle of a fight, when you're in a sketchy position where the guy could pick you up and slam you on your head if you get it wrong, really hard to do. But if you watched every time Sandhagen gave up his back on the feet, he just looked down, got the hands, peeled them apart in a legal way, not like ripping fingers back, turned back in and got out. And that was super impressive. The other thing that you saw loads of was him rolling over, rolling over his shoulder as Umar was behind him on the mat. Because Umar will sit down and try and put you into his lap, which is something that Pantoja does, the flyweight champion. And it's something you can do. You're very confident at taking backs or coming up on passes. But you won't see a lot of wrestlers do it, typically. Though the crab ride traditionally is a move from wrestling that jiu-jitsu stole. But Umar would keep coming up behind Sandhagen or sitting down with Sandhagen on top of him, and Sandhagen would end up on top of him or sitting in front of him. And there's a really interesting move. There are moves in MMA that happened 20 years ago that fell out of fashion because they don't really work anymore. People came up with a good counter and it became too dangerous to do them. There are moves that just sort of got forgotten by the wayside. And I'm trying to remember who it was sort of bringing it back a few years ago. It might have been Yancy Medeiros, of all people. But I remember talking about it on this very podcast. I said, this is something Sakuraba used to do back in 2001. Did it against Royce Gracie and almost broke his leg. Did it against Carlos Newton, and I believe, did he manage to knee bar Newton? I think he did, yeah. When someone's on your back backpacking you, and you're sat on your bum, you can peel their legs out from inside your hips and start sliding your bum backwards over one of their knees. And when you slid your bum backward over their leg, you grab it between your legs and you pull it up so that their knee is inside your legs and you pinch your knees around it and you are in a position to start attacking their leg. Sakuraba did it quite a lot back in the day because he used to give up his back a lot. And, he threatened to stand up with Kimuras, but if they pulled him backwards onto his bum, that's when he'd start trying to slide his bum over a leg and put them in a knee bar. Sandhagen did that loads in this fight. And it works really well. And I don't know why no one does it. He might have done it against TJ Dillashaw, come to think of it, because he ended up in an extended leg entanglement with Dillashaw too. But his back defense on the floor looked great. He ended up in a crucifix at a couple of points, kicked his arm free and rolled out of that too. He just looked unsubmittable. And his takedown defense didn't look too bad. So the problem was that Umar Nurmagomedov outstruck him. Not in knocking him down, looking awesome, oh my God, what happened to Corey Sandhagen kind of way. I've seen some people being like, oh, Trevor Whitman ruined Sandhagen, blah, blah, blah. But the issue that you're going to face with this team in particular, with their incredibly strong takedowns and their brilliant conditioning, their ability to just go for it constantly, is that the wrestling is a weapon that puts them on offense. If you can't deal with the wrestling, everything else is a non-starter because you can't strike when you're defending takedowns. You can't strike off your back. You can't strike in the process of getting back up to your feet. You can't strike if you're stuck against the cage. If you can defend the takedowns, it's not a simple switch where it's like, well, now I'm going to lump him up on the feet. The wrestling stays as the sword of Damocles hanging over your head. Corey Sandhagen was out-volumed by Umar Nurmagomedov because he couldn't step up the volume. He couldn't risk it. He didn't feel comfortable opening up with huge amounts of volume because that opens him up to takedown attempts. And this is something we talked about in the pre-fight, but it's like, how are you going to exploit holes in someone's striking if you're only able to throw one or two big strikes at a time? You can't really do... exploiting tendencies in striking means using feints and double jabs and combinations, setting things up, throwing things away just to get the responses you want. And you can't really do that if at every point you're worried about them dropping on your hips. Early in this fight, I really liked that Umar's throwing these kicks because Umar is known for his kicks, but he's never knocked out anyone with a head kick. He's hurt one person ever in all the fights I saw, and that was Morozov. they go on about the question mark kick forever, but it's really just there to score points and keep the other guy honest and give him stuff to worry about. I did like that he landed a couple of body kicks in this one, because I'm always going, you have great head kicks, or you have, very mechanically fast head kicks that have people scared, so you should be landing body kicks. If you want to kick people in the head, kick them in the body. If you are good at kicking people in the head, they keep their arms up, so you kick them in the body for free. But in most of his fights, he doesn't kick the body much. And in this one, he actually started to, which I really enjoyed. But as I was saying, one thing I really liked in the early going of this fight was that Corey would try and walk Umar down, which is important if you're going to try and take advantage of his back-leaning right hook and all the stuff that he just goes to over and over again. But then Umar would throw a kick at him and Corey would step back. And just as Corey was coming back in, he'd dive on the legs. Because every time Umar kicked, Sandhagen would back off. And then after he backs off, what's he going to do? He can't stay out at that range, so he's going to come forward. So then you dive on his legs. It's we talk about it quite a lot, but you don't have an awful lot of control in the standing portion of a fight. If you pressure someone towards the cage and the cage cuts them off, they takes away part of the circle around them they can move in, that's a form of control. But the only real control you have is that if you take a step back, the other guy will probably take a step forward, because otherwise you're not having a fight. And that piece of knowledge you can use quite well as a hobbyist or early in your martial arts journey, that if you take a step back, you can expect the other guy to step forward. And if they take a step back and you don't step forward, they'll probably step back towards you again, which is what happened here. Threw a kick, Corey backed up, waited, Corey stepped back in, level changed on the leg. There was a beautiful... He does these singles with the head on the outside, which is something that you can go and watch seminars with Abdul Manap Nurmagomedov, very influential guy. If you don't know, that's Habib's dad. That's the guy who's responsible for this whole team and their strategies. And he had a seminar that I think Sonny Brown had translated, but he talks about the head outside single. In America, they call it the high crotch, but then some people differentiate the high crotch as a head outside single that you finish as a double leg. That's the very American way to do it traditionally. But a single leg with your head on the outside of their body instead of on the inside, which in grappling sports typically exposes you more to the threat of the guillotine. But you see with these guys, they shoot with their head on the outside, and if the guy wraps the guillotine, it's almost like he's given them more of a handle to crack them down or to crack them down by. So you'll see Umar in his last couple of fights, he grabs the single with his head outside, the other guy wraps his head, and he just plops them down on that side and shrugs his shoulders. Because, as I always say, shrugging your shoulders, number one defense against guillotines. If your shoulder is against your neck on the side that they want to get flush on your neck on, guillotine's a non-starter. It's not there, mate. They're just wrapping your head. But Umar, in the last round of this fight, he shoots a head outside single on the rear leg. He times Sandhagen throwing a right hand and shoots on the rear leg, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I can't remember if Sandhagen actually stuffs the takedown, but a lot of what Sandhagen was doing was creating scrambles after conceding a position off the takedown, but he also stopped a few takedowns quite impressively. His wrestling, he looks night and day from the guy who started out in the UFC. It's just that Umar out-volumed him here. And on to Umar's striking. In my study, which you should read again, which isn't on the Patreon, it's up for free for everyone at the Fight Primer, and I'll link it on the YouTube. We talked about Umar's habits and how he's very right-hand heavy, and he fights southpaw for most of his fights. He goes orthodox, but when he gets put under pressure, he goes back to southpaw and he starts leaning back and swinging his right hook. And it's kind of like, I described it as like if you and your mates put on boxing gloves knowing nothing and you just want to poke with your strong hand all the time, you'll start standing with your right foot forward, you'll be jabbing with your right hand, you'll be leaning back and throwing your lead hand as the main counter. And that was kind of how he looked in a lot of his fights. And I said his left hand really is an afterthought in a lot of these fights, with the exception of the Hannibal Salas one where he... it looked like an afterthought in that he didn't expect to chin him with it. He didn't expect to knock Hannibal Salas out with it because it was such a short punch. And he looks absolutely bamboozled by the fact that it does. But then that's, the shot that you don't see coming is the one that knocks you out. And I suppose by never throwing your left hand, it becomes a bit of a surprise. But in this fight, he really was dexterous with his left hand. Not only did he fight orthodox for large stretches of the fight, he landed his jab from orthodox, so his left hand jab, and then he would retreat to southpaw because that's his natural stance. And he'd counter in combination. So he'd jab and then Corey would come back to something and he'd throw like a 1-2-3 or just lean back and throw hooks. But the confidence in throwing in combination I really liked because he doesn't do that a lot. That's never been a big part of his game. Two-handed hitting has never been a big part of his game, and he was doing it effectively here. So big ups to Umar Nurmagomedov. Very exciting to have yet another contender in this awesome division. And big ups to Corey Sandhagen's wrestling and scrambling. Everyone and their mum should be looking at that awesome knee bar / leg entanglement by sliding over the leg when they've got your back, or, as you escape the back. And looking at how he separates the hands, because he's so quick at it. I want you to think of it like Khabib versus Abel Trujillo, or Islam versus Thiago Moises. Two good wrestlers, or good grapplers, completely unable to separate their hands and just keep getting mat returned over and over again. Sandhagen got none of the grappling pedigree of those two guys, peeling hands off constantly. So all in all, pretty chuffed with that main event. I'll read you the last line of my preview. Rising out of a year-long swamp of UFC apex dirge, Corey Sandhagen versus Umar Nurmagomedov is a gleaming beacon of hope for the weary MMA fan. Yep, turns out if you match interesting fighters up against each other in interesting divisions, in fights with interesting repercussions, it's good. So what else did I like from this card? I won't linger on like absolute dog shit like Shamil Gaziev versus Dontel Mays, Cedric Dumas versus Dennis Tululin. We knew those were bad going in. Joel Alvarez versus Elvis Brenner was awesome. It's great to have Joel Alvarez back. I was shocked when I was going through this on the Boycast, because I was like, I love Joel Alvarez. Where's he been? Looked back, he's won one. He famously lost. Most of us remember him losing to Sarukian back in 2022, right at the start of 2022, because he was on a 4-fight winning streak going into that, and it was like he was about level with Arman Sarukian in terms of hype and momentum, and Sarukian just steamrolled him. But he actually fought Jacasey in mid-2023 and darsed him in round 2. But then he's had like 3 cancellations since then, all because of him. He had visa issues and injuries. And so, yeah, 1 fight since 2022, right at the start of 2022. Finally gets back in action with Elvis Brenner. And Elvis Brenner, obviously everyone loves him from the Guram Kutataladze fight where he was a massive underdog. Lost his last one with Oral By, which broke his streak, but he was competitive in that fight, and it was a decision win for Oral By. But man, Joel Alvarez blew him out of the water, just walked him down. This is what I like. Joel Alvarez is a tall guy for the weight class, which a lot of people get mad at if you use it. If you use your height and reach, you are a height bully, and you should be drowned or forced to fight up a weight class. But there are guys like Joel Alvarez, and if you watch Mansour Barnoui fight striking, they walk people down and they use their length in interesting ways, length and height. If you're taller than your opponent, you can abuse knees to the head. That's your weapon, not their weapon. If you're like half a foot taller than the other guy, he's not going to knee you in the head standing. Unless you bend over, then he can knee you in the head. Folding elbows, because you've got your elbow length is going to be longer than their elbow considerably, and it's going to be like almost as long as their punches if you're really long and lanky. Think John Jones versus Rashad Evans. And Joel Alvarez was doing that in this fight. He's throwing beautiful long right straights. He's walking Brenner down. He's grabbing the double collar tie and hammering knees to the head. Brenner took a ton of damage in this fight. And the stoppage was a little bit like, probably should have thrown the towel before that. He took a load of knees to the head. Just great to have Alvarez back. And honestly, his takedown defense looked pretty good, because he's always attacked off his back. But against Arman Sarukian, that was obviously terrible because he just got elbowed to death. I thought he looked pretty good wrestling here. And that's what can happen. If you don't see a guy for 2 years, suddenly they're not what you remember. Kind of like Corey Sandhagen can wrestle now, and I always think of him as the guy who can't. Umar Nurmagomedov has a left hand now. Or does he? Because that's the other thing about fighting. Guys will come in with a weapon, and they'll show it in one fight, and you'll go, oh my God, he's going to be a handful with that now. There was a period when Aldo turned up for one fight, it might have been the first Frankie Edgar fight, with a wicked jab. And then for the next 3 years, he barely used his jab. It's really weird. Or Chad Mendes turns up for the second Jose Aldo fight. He's got these beautiful low kicks and combinations and stuff. Every fight after, he's back to just swinging the overhand. Co-main event was Sharon Magomedov versus Alexajuk. This is kind of a one, because on the one hand, they're matching this guy up carefully, because Alexajuk is just a left hand. He has nothing else. But on the other hand, how many good wrestlers are there at middleweight? They managed to get Pereira to the title, and they got him to a title in a second division without, he met Jan Blachowicz, and everyone went, yeah, well, Jan's actually one of the better wrestlers in the division, and you couldn't name like 2 other wrestlers in the division. Above 170, there just aren't really very many guys who use it as their A game, and there are so few like well-rounded guys who can mix it in. But Nurmagomedov looked great in this. Khadzhikatad looked terrible. This guy, he's known for having a great left hand, because I'm always telling you, like, oh, I really like his left hand, and nothing else about his game. But he's doing this thing where he's reaching out with his right hand and throwing his left hand at the same time, so he just ends up walking forward like a zombie at several points in this fight. It's like, no, like, pull your right hand back as you throw. It doesn't matter if you're checking his hands or not. Your chance in this fight is throwing something big. Nurmagomedov circled, kicked, did lots of that. Liked his elbows. He timed a beautiful up elbow with his rear hand, or rear elbow, as Khadzhikatad was diving in with a big left swing. It was like Muang Thai, a guy I mentioned a lot on the podcast, Muangthai. Go and search that name on YouTube. Probably the best elbow fighter in recent years, and certainly the most enthusiastic elbow fighter in recent years. He just walks people down. They called him the elbow zombie because he walks people down and he punches them with his elbows. And he used to do that all the time. Rear arm, up elbow, but like thrown like a straight, basically forwards. Like Magomedov's hands in this fight, his hands aren't great. I wouldn't like put boxing as one of his top skills, but he used his left hook to pivot and circle round Khadzhikatad a lot. Grabbed the double collar tie and kneed the head tons. Just a thoroughly entertaining fight from him. However, Khadzhikatad, in the last round, he did a bad impression of Jacob Malkoun. Reached forward, grabbed the leg with his head on the outside, ran to the fence, hit the Malkoun single, which I've got a video on my YouTube, the Filthy Casual's Guide to Jacob Malkoun's one game-breaking technique, or whatever it was. This is the only thing Jacob Malkoun ever does, and no one has an answer for it. Khadzhikatad, doing a shitty impression of Malkoun, easily slung Magomedov to the mat and stayed on top for the rest of the round. Had he done it earlier? Who knows? But Jacob Malkoun ruins this boy's night, Magomedov. I'm not saying he'd knock him out or finish him. I'm saying he'd have 15 sketchy minutes where he got hit too much, but he would be doing this takedown over and over and over again. Tony Ferguson threatened to retire, but then ultimately came back on Twitter and was like, it's not over, I'm going again, after losing to Michael Chiesa. Chiesa looked all right. I mean, Tony just looks too small for welterweight. He's slow and old, and yeah, just continuing the decline of Tony. And then Deiveson Figueiredo versus Marlon Vera was quite fun. It was classic. Well, if you make Deiveson Figueiredo look like a volume fighter, you're doing very badly, because Deiveson Figueiredo has his own problems with not throwing enough. Marlon Vera, classic conundrum. What he always has is like, he's terrified to do anything. He's always on about how hard he trains his cardio, but he fights like he's terrified of getting tired. But he's got a good jab, so he could build volume, but when he tries to use that jab, he just sort of goes jab, and like where he would previously like swing a right hand or a big kick every half a minute, he replaces that with a jab, when in fact he should be going like jab every couple of seconds to set up other punches and stuff. He was using an inside low kick to jab, a step up inside low kick, and he used that to set up a nice outside low kick. The step up inside low kick is a terrific weapon because it's so easy to block, but the opponent blocking it is what opens up other stuff. So Volkanovski uses it a ton, and when you do that little step up and they pick up their leg and turn it into check, they're vulnerable to being hit in the face because they're standing on one leg. So Volk does the T-step jab, which is where you step up as if to inside low kick and then you jab instead. Or you can throw the right low kick. You step up as if to throw the inside low kick, and then you step again and throw the right low kick to the outside because their legs turned in, which Chito Vera did in this fight once. But for a lot of this fight, he's flicking this kick into the upper shin where it won't hurt at all, and then poking the jab off it and doing nothing with it. And Deiveson Figueiredo's landing good body shots. He's landing good punches to the head, and he's landing brilliant. Well, what Deiveson Figueiredo's always been good at, even when he wasn't good at wrestling, he was good at throwing a punch, pulling back from your return, and then getting in on your hips. And he was doing that flawlessly in this fight. Vera finally started to come on in the last round, but yeah, I mean, too little too late. And then he got dropped as well, which didn't help. But it's so funny. It used to be Dean Thomas had to do this with Tyron Woodley. Now it's every single fight. Jason Perillo has to come out. And clearly Chito doesn't react well to being told that he's not doing well. So Perillo has to say, like, great round. Really good stuff. Could you throw some strikes this time? That'd be nice. And as the fight progresses, it's like Jason Perillo has to try and promise him things. He's like, we'll stop and get ice cream on the way home if you throw more than 10 strikes this round. And by the end, it's like, Cheeto, I've got your kids. If you don't throw more than 10 strikes, something terrible is going to happen. And he never, ever reacts to it. He never fucking does his job and throws strikes. He's got to be the hardest. It's got to be the most unrewarding job in the world, coaching Cheeto Vera. And then the really good fight was Guram Kutateladze versus Jordan Vicenik. This probably should have got fight of the night. I suppose, did the main event get fight of the night? Oh no, they gave it to the co-main. Very weird decision. But yeah, if you like good high-level MMA, Kutateladze versus Vicenik was bloody awesome. Vicenik coming in from Cage Warriors. I believe this was on short notice, wasn't it? Guram was originally going to fight El Sawadi, who pulled out due to injury. Vicenik's former Cage Warriors champion. Tons of exciting fights there. Fought Paul Hughes, Morgan Charrier. But there were two things he was doing at the start of this fight that I really liked. Jab to dipping left hook, so hooking off the jab and getting his head offline while he did it. Loved that. And then the right hand lead into the weave into follow-up punches, which I really liked. Because he was going right hand, moving his left foot as he threw his right hand, and then bringing his right foot up behind it and stepping across to his right. Really nice. Hooking off the jab, unexpected and cool. Leading with the right hand once you've actually shown that you have a good jab, also unexpected. And he made Guram Kutateladze look really slow for the first round and a bit. Guram was trying to time like quick switch left kicks to the body and things as Vicenik came in, but it wasn't really working. Managed to get the fight into the clinch and slow him down a little bit from there. And then as the third round progressed, he was back into it with his own striking. Ultimately, I'd put this down as a veteran performance from Kutateladze. I think Vicenik looked awesome. Kutateladze's having a hard time because he had that phenomenal performance against Matej Gamrot back in 2020, where he like derailed the hype train before it even got going. Gamrot came to the UFC from KSW and people were like, oh, so exciting. And then he just made him look bad. But since then, he lost 2 in a row, Ismagulov and Brenner. Ismagulov was a really competitive fight. I mean, it was basically the same as the Gamrot fight. It was really high level, technical, competitive, but he lost the split decision on that one. But the Elvis Brenner one, after like a year off after the Ismagulov fight, he ended up getting stopped in that one, and that was a bit of a shock. So people were talking about him being washed. Certainly didn't look like untouchable, or the level of talent that people expect from him because of that Gamrot fight wasn't on show here. But, you know, he's had one fight every 12, 13 months for the last 3 fights. So it would be really great if he just turned this around quickly and got another fight in. Could be ring rust, could be slowing down. Did get pretty badly injured. Was that before the Brenner fight? Oh, and he was injured before the Ismagulov fight. But, you know, it's like Tony Ferguson. Yes, he fought some really good guys at the top of their game when he started his losing streak, but also he had injuries that were forcing him to, you know, the Khabib fights fell through twice because of him and twice because of Khabib, and once because of the pandemic. But he'd severed his ACL, and I think he'd done it again since then. And, you know, these things add up, and it will sap your speed and your ability to move as fluidly. If you watch him doing his like warm-up, crawling on his knees and shooting stuff, that it's kind of like the Cain Velasquez clips of him warming up before his fights. He's leaping through the air for the early ones, you know, going down into crouch, jumping up as high as he can. And for the other ones, he's moving like Kamaru Usman. Have you seen Kamaru Usman when he wants to run, when he's trying to move fast, when he knocked down Colby Covington? His knees lock up and he just walks with straight legs towards him. It's tragic. But that's wrestling. Wrestling will just fuck your knees up for life. And so will judo. There's no way out of it. I mean, the only way out of it is to start from the knees, which everyone hates in grappling. Anyway, that's the fights that were. Next week's fights are trash, so we'll talk about those on the Boycast, but we'll also talk about Crawford winning yet another title at yet another weight. We'll talk about the PFL. We'll talk about the one card that was on with my boy Balart. 4'11" and somehow still missed weight. There's not a weight class that exists that you should be able to miss weight at 4'11", but he did it. And other stuff too. So yeah, if you want to get in on the extra podcasts and all the boy stuff, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing, including that Umar Nurmagomedov study, fightprimer.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Shamil Gaziev back in the win column, baby. Bless.